The Archons. What's your, you wrote a book about them. What's your take on the Archons? A lot of people don't believe they exist. A lot of people believe they feed off our negative energy and fear, which is why around now, September 23rd, when we are recording this, that they've just been feasting off all of the fear that's been going on regarding, the end of the world. What about the Archons?
Yeah, well, the word itself, it's just a Greek word. It means chief, commander, leader, somebody in a position of authority. Where it talks about the prince of the power of the air, for instance. If I'm not mistaken, where it says prince right there, it's the word Archon. I titled my book Archon Invasion just because I thought the word was unusual and kind of cool. I had really, just to be transparent, I didn't really have any other agenda with it. I thought, I need a catchy title. And I was researching in the book of Enoch regarding the 200 Watcher class angels that landed on Mount Hermon in the days of Jared. And it names 22 or 23 leaders over the 200. Well, the leaders of the 200 would have been called Archons because that's what the word means. It's a commander, a chief, somebody in a position of authority, a leader. So I call it the Archon Invasion, and didn't realize at that time that the people in the New Age and the occult and in UFO circles and places like that, they have sort of a different idea of what an Archon is. Although not too different. It would basically fit the same descriptions, but they look at them as ascended masters, Count Germain, Saint Germain and all that. That these are these higher spiritual entities, ascended masters and all that kind of stuff. And so when I published the book with the title Archon Invasion, an unintended side effect of that was I got a fair amount of people who bought the book who were probably hoping that it talked about something different, but instead got a whole bunch of scripture and my take on these fallen angels and what they were. But I would say as a result of that, I also got a lot of emails and letters and stuff sent to me from people who were atheists or were into the occult or New Agers or whatnot, that had their eyes open to a different point of view and realized that what they thought was so cool was actually very dangerous and very dark. You'll note that it says ascended masters. Well, to ascend means to come up from someplace below. These so-called masters are coming up from someplace down. Not good. I'm looking for my soon-to-be descending master. If they're ascending, that's a problem. So, but for the purposes of my book, it was basically just talking about the Watcher class angels, that the fallen ones that landed on Mount Hermon in the days of Jared. Now, to your other point, I do believe these fallen ones feed on fear, and I know this for a fact from practical and unfortunate experience with shadow people. I've had a number of experiences growing up with what I called the shadow people, and I called them that before that became sort of in vogue. In fact, I was listening to the Art Bell show, and I think this was 1997 maybe, when it was Open Line Friday, and some caller called in from somewhere, whatever topic, open line, you can talk about whatever. And this person says, Art, I've been having these experiences with these, I don't know what to call them. I call them shadow people. And I kid you not, I was literally on my computer writing a movie script called The Shadow People. That's the title of the script that I was writing. And so I'm like, I'm listening in the background. And I hear this guy, and I'm like, what? I'm like, are you kidding me? And all of a sudden, Art's phone lines just lit up. People started calling from everywhere. And I thought, well, shoot, I'm going to call too. So I called. I actually got on. I was one of the callers that got on that first broadcast and shared a little bit of my experience. And he had so many people write to him and calling. His phone lines just blew up. So he's like, wow, I've obviously opened up something here. He said, well, I'm going to have my webmaster create a page where you guys can draw pictures of what you've seen and send them to my webmaster, and then we'll put them up on the website. And people from all over drew pictures of what they had experienced, and everybody's drawing the same thing. They're all drawing very similar looking creatures. And one in particular that really caught my attention is what has become known as the Hat Man. He's a shadow man, but he's a guy wearing like a derby kind of hat, and some say with a trench coat also. And I've seen Derby Man, and my a good friend of mine that I met in the Army, named Dave. We were talking in a hangar one day, working on a helicopter about stuff, and somehow the subject of the shadow people came up, and I started sharing my experiences, and he started sharing. We were finishing each other's sentences, and then this happened, and he looked like this, right? And like we were both freaking out because we're like, oh my god, we both seen the same thing. So he was the only other person that I had met at that time. This is back in the late '80s, early '90s, who had the same experiences that I had, and described it the same way. But then on the Art Bell show, boom, everybody starts saying they had the same experience. So in my experience, it was always a sleep paralysis scenario where you can't move, you're in bed, and at least in my experience, they would always try to choke me. And the only thing that got rid of them was invoking the name of Jesus. I would say, in the name of Jesus, let go of me, and it would go. But there was one time, and the worst of all of the times that I had experienced, and that thing followed me around. It wasn't just in my home in Massachusetts. I did a job in Maine, and it followed me up to Maine. I moved to Texas, and followed me to Texas. So, I mean, I had experiences in multiple places, and I ultimately believe that came as a result of people in my house had dabbled with Wicca and also Ouija boards. And I did neither of those things. But I mean, we can open up doorways through sin and other things in our life, I think, that can welcome things that may already be there as a result of other people doing things, you know what I mean? So, the thing followed me around, and the worst one was here in Texas. And a few times, I invoked the name of Jesus, cast out in the name of Jesus, and it would go, which made me believe, okay, this thing has to be demonic, because the demons flee at the name of Jesus. But this one time in particular, this one was a tough one. It was really doing a job on me, and I was trying to get the word Jesus out, and it wasn't coming out. And then all of a sudden, I heard basically its voice coming out of my mouth. Like, the voice that was coming out of my mouth wasn't me. It was changed, and it was mocking. I'm trying to say the name of Jesus, but it's coming out like like it was like mocking, like it wasn't even afraid, And so, but at that point, I was in a crucible in my life. I was going through a really painful divorce and bankruptcy, and had been living in my car. I was homeless for a little while. I was in a very rough place in my life, and maybe it was mocking the name of Jesus, because at that point I was at a low point in my life where my relationship with him wasn't what it should be, and so maybe that's the case. I don't know, but whatever, the name wasn't working, and I was frankly suicidal at the time anyway. So I was like, you know what? Good, get it over with. If you're here to take me, do it. And all of a sudden it went away. And that's when I realized, okay, this thing feeds on fear. Yes, it itself is normally afraid of the name of Jesus. But when I didn't have fear anymore, when I was just like, whatever, go ahead, it lost its power over me. So I believe that these things do actually feed on fear, and that's why they generate it. And people who like to go to the scary movies and do the Ouija board and intentionally do things to scare themselves, you're playing with fire. I understand it's fun to get that adrenaline rush when you get scared. I get it, but you really are playing with fire, and you're opening yourself up. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but it could. You very well could open yourself up to spiritual hijackers, and this may jump on board, whether you want them to or not. And if they do, it's not good. It never is when you open yourself up to the darkness. So however you look at it, the Archons are not entities that you, in the sense of the fallen ones. There are good Archons too. Michael, the Archangel, is a leader. So he would have to be an Archon by the Greek definition. If it's anybody who's in a commanding position of authority, a leader would be an Archon. So I want to demystify the word. It's just a Greek word that we use for positions of authority. But in pop culture, it has spun off into sort of this ascended master kind of spiritual entity thing. And in those cases, most of the time, it's of the fallen realm, and you don't want to mess around with that stuff.
So Michael, the Archangel, is above in the stars, but the shadow people, archangels, are below, but some are up here with us because somebody else has perhaps called them into being, and they can affect you if you're maybe low spiritually or you're playing with fire, like using a Ouija board or something. Does that kind of sum up what you just said?
Sort of, but I want to make a little bit of a correction. A lot of people think that demons are fallen angels. They're not. Fallen angels are just, they're regular angels that are rebellious. So if I would use the term genetically, just for the sake of argument, for lack of a better term, they would be the same as good angels. They're just, just like, Adolf Hitler was the same as you as me. He was just a bad man who did bad things, but I mean, physically he was a human being with red blood and, the whole deal, or unless you think he's a reptilian, and that's a whole, that's another show. But, you see what I'm saying? Fallen angels are just regular, normal angels that were rebellious. So, and they have bodies of their own. They apparently can be shapeshifters. They can appear as humans. We're told that we could entertain angels unaware. In other words, somebody could be right in front of you. You don't even know it. They're an angel. They showed up in the Bible, to Abraham and different people. So angels are angels, whether, they're fallen or not. They're a type of being. Demons, on the other hand, are the disembodied spirits of formerly living Nephilm, or angel-human hybrids. The Book of Enoch tells you that when an angel mates with a woman, and they produce an offspring called a Nephilim, which is plural, actually. So offspring is in plural. The Nephilim, angel-human hybrids, when you kill one of them, because they were never meant to exist in the first place. They're an abomination. They are the union of spirit and flesh that was never meant to take place in the first place. So since God never intended for them to exist in the first place, when you kill the body of one of those things, the spirit goes out and becomes a wandering evil spirit that we call demons. I believe that's in 1 Enoch chapter 15, if I remember the address right. It tells you point blank that's what demons are. So they have nowhere to go. And since they used to have a body, they desire to have a body again. So that's why they possess bodies. That's why when Yeshua came up on the maniac, that had the 1,000, demons, the legion in him, and they said, well, if you're going to cast us out, put us in the pigs. They need a body to get into. So I wouldn't necessarily classify the shadow people as angelic, fallen, or otherwise. I would probably say that they were demon, that they were demonic. So demonic being the disembodied spirits of former Nephilim, which also helps to explain why, a little girl, 8-year-old girl could become possessed by a demon and throw like 3, 6 foot, 200-pound men off of her like it's nothing. Well, she might have the spirit inside of her of a 18-foot giant, or a 30-foot giant or something, That's why they're disproportionately strong, for a little kid to be able to just break chains and throw big men around. They've got the spiritual entity inside of them from a former hybrid, according to the ancient text.
Do you think that you have ever entertained an angel unaware?
I do. Yeah.
Can you tell us?
Yeah, on a few occasions. One, I was in a really rough place in 1990, and I ended up sitting on a plane. I was living in Massachusetts, but I was visiting friends in Austin, and was going to fly back home, and was just really struggling with something. I don't even remember what the subject was, but whatever it was really kind of tweaking me out and bothering me, and actually getting me to question the Bible. Which is kind of interesting that we're having this conversation now that this is coming up. I haven't thought about this in a long time, but I don't remember what the subject was, but whatever it was, I was really struggling with like, man, if I can't figure this out, I don't know if I can trust the Bible anymore. And wherever it was, I was sitting on the plane, something happened and they had to move my seat. And so I got moved to the back, and it ended up sitting next to this guy, and his window, he was a window seat. I had the aisle seat. If you open up his window, you're looking at the engine. The engine was like right there. So it was actually really loud back there. And I just was remembering being in a really desperate place in my life at that time. So I was sitting there and I was praying, and I'm like, God, please, you gotta help me out here, because I don't know what to do with this. I'm really struggling with this. And the guy next to me knew that something was wrong, and he just kind of sensed it or whatever. And he said, "Are you all right?" And I said, yeah, physically I am, but I'm kind of struggling with some things. And, we ended up talking. Well, this guy starts trying to witness to me. Like, he was apparently a Christian. And I said, look, save your breath, man. I mean, I've believed what you're saying since I was 7 years old. I mean, I get that, but I've really got a problem with this. And started talking to him about whatever that issue was. And he started to minister to me answers that were actually finally making sense to me, but I could barely hear the guy because the engine was so loud. And I'm like, God, please. I mean, of all things, I got moved around the plane. I ended up sitting right next to this guy. He's got the answer and I can't hear him. So I'm praying, like, please, I was listening to him, my eyes open, but in my head, I'm like, please, God, I mean, I can't hear this guy. And all of a sudden the engines went quiet. The guy get on the speaker, the pilot says, we're at our cruising altitude, blah, 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 said his thing, and it got pretty quiet. And finally I could hear the guy. And for the whole flight from just after we had just taken off, not long after we left Austin, probably about the time we reached cruising altitude, from that point till we got to Hartford, Connecticut, this guy really ministered to me, like, big time. And when we landed, actually he got off. We flew to, I think it was Pennsylvania. He got off in Pennsylvania. So I think it was Pennsylvania. So we flew to Pennsylvania. I had to get up so he could get out and get his luggage over the top. And, we shook hands and everything. Nice to meet you. Yeah, yeah. And I just said, it was real quick. I just said, God, thank you so much for sending this guy. And I kid you not, I opened my eyes, and the time it took me to say that, he was gone. And we were in the back of the plane. Like, he was standing next to me getting his luggage. I'm praying that quick prayer. And I look up, and he's not there. And I'm looking, and, maybe he was, I don't know, but I could not see that guy. And I tried. I'm like, was this what, I would have liked to have been the guy on the other side looking towards me, wondering if I was talking to an empty seat there. You know what I mean? I don't know, but that was one experience. And I've had others kind of similar but that would be the most intriguing one, that I would say, I believe that I, at that moment, entertained an angel unaware.
Wow. So, I mean, it behooves all of us, no matter who we're with, what we're doing, to treat everyone as if they potentially are that. I mean, that's a good way to go through life. Not that I always do that, but I am trying every day, trying harder to be a good person. And I think that's what we all are doing, or hopefully so, especially since the flat earth. I was almost an atheist. I mean, without saying I was an atheist, before the flat earth came into my life. And it really changed me. And watching your videos, as well as many other people's, have set me on a different path. I now own a Bible. I now own Enoch. I own things I never would have, that I almost laughed at before, that are now a part of my life. And I wish I could go back in time, and I never laughed in anyone's face or made fun of anybody about their biblical beliefs, but I would pretty much just say that's not what I'm into. And I wish I could apologize to the people who have maybe potentially tried to show me a different path through life. But you can only do what you can do now and then into the future. We're talking with Rob Skiba on Flat Earth and Other Hot Potatoes, number 10, and we'll bring Flat Earth back into it. We've gone on a deep religious tangent, and I'm sure that'll continue to be the case because Rob is my guest, and that's where he comes from. That's the place he's coming from. I did notice that there's skulls behind you, and tell us about those golden skulls.
Yeah, this one here, this is a female from Peru. Now this is a replica. It's not an actual skull, but it's a replica. I think it's actually a first generation replica taken from a casting of the actual skull in Peru. Now this is what they call a conehead skull, obviously. A lot of people think that this is a result of cranial cranial headboarding, where they strap boards to a baby's head, because when the babies, when they're young, their skull is still pliable. Well, yes, if you strap boards to a baby's head, it will change the shape of the baby's head, but it's not going to change the suture pattern. I don't know if you can see that, but you and I have a vertical suture pattern right here. We have, you have the frontal lobe, two parietal, occipital plates. We've got a vertical line goes this way with two parietal plates. This one doesn't have that. It doesn't have that line. So not only does this skull have about 25% more brain capacity than an average skull of a person of the same size as this person was, so it's got about 25% more brain. It also has a completely different suture pattern. And it has some other other anomalies in the skull and stuff too that we don't have. So this person was born this way.
The suture patterns in the skull are off. This one lacks the separation that you would find in a normal human skull. On the top here, there should be a suture here. There's not one. The sutures, of course, are basically the interlocking joints that you would find in the skull. What I notice here also is that while this looks on the surface to be cranial deformation, it seems to me that there's more cranial capacity. Of course, without having done the anthropometry on the skull myself, but there's more cranial capacity here. It's not as pronounced in skulls such as the Chongo skulls from Ica, which have very high vaulted domes, and you can visibly see that you're looking at probably about 25%. But you're definitely looking at a skull here that displays some anomalous features. And there is an extra foramen in the back of the skull, and you would probably have to zoom in to find it. But this is probably a foramen. It could be, I suppose it could be trepanation, but this is probably another foramen, which is one of the things that I noticed on a number of the skulls in a Paracas collection. And my question was, what is this doing here? Well, there are a number of reasons. It could be carrying extra blood supply to the brain. There could be additional nerve bundles that would attach in some way to the vertebral column. But there's something going on in the skull morphologically that goes beyond simple cranial deformation.
What I'm discussing today is my Elongated Skulls of Peru and Bolivia book, and it's dedicated to Senor Juan Navarro, who is my mentor in Paracas, Peru. Here's Senor Juan holding a 20-month-old elongated head with, as you can see, reddish blonde hair. The Egyptians supposedly had elongated heads, but what we do know is that this was a phenomenon around the world, especially in ancient times. Different forms of head binding were used amongst the royalty, and this happened literally all over the planet, most commonly 2,000 years ago. But some of the skulls, like the one on the left, appear to be natural looking. Wherever you find a megalithic site in Peru, you find elongated skulls. And they come in many different shapes and sizes, like this one. This is one of the oldest, about 4,000 years ago, the Huancarani people of Bolivia, but they've also been found plentifully at Tiwanaku and Pumapunku, such as this one, which actually is on private property in the area. Some facial reconstruction has been attempted recently in Bolivia to see what they looked like. This is a baby found near Lake Titicaca, less than a year old. And the most fascinating one possibly is this one, Waiki, located about an hour south of Cusco. You can see that Waiki's body is the size of its head, or its head is the size of its body. Estimated to be about 2 years old because the foramen, or fontanelle, you can see on top of the head, wasn't fully closed. But the teeth appear to be that of an older child than 2 years old. This was a 16-year-old princess who died at least 1,000 years ago near Cusco, and it's possible that the Inca themselves may have originally had elongated heads, because several have been found in the Cusco area dating to the Inca times or earlier. And in tombs at Ollantaytambo, monstrous skull like that one. They've been found all over the highlands of Peru from antiquity. And this, in this case, is near Waitara, east of Paracas in the highlands. You see that the head, again, is the size of the torso. This cannot be explained by simple binding techniques. The largest skulls in the world have been found in the Paracas, Peru area. And again, they come in different shapes and sizes, only the royalty. This is a map of the Paracas area, about 4 hours south of Lima, and it's the Paracas people who did a lot of the so-called Nazca lines and figures before the Nazca ever existed. Again, the Paracas came in different shapes and sizes. It was only the royalty that this was done to. This is an obvious example of cranial deformation, but what about this one? Look at the size and the shape. How could you bind that shape? Now, all of us have two major suture lines, which you can see here, but many of the Paracas have only one. That's quite a mystery. And it's known by archaeologists that the Paracas also created the famous astronaut, as well as multiple other figures in the Palpa area between Paracas and Nazca, and created a great city called Cahuachi. Now, the Nazca, when they invaded Paracas, used the skulls for divination. And this is a classic Paracas with also the royal red hair. And again, a baby with reddish blonde hair. Great depictions have been done by artists such as Marc Laplume here, who has done thousands of drawings of what the elongated skulls may have looked like, as well as Marcia K. Moore of CMR Studio, who has done three-dimensional renderings based on actual skulls. So she's fleshed these out to see what these people, the Paracas especially, may have looked like 2,000 plus years ago. Because the Paracas suddenly appear 3,000 years ago and disappear 2,000 years ago. But my job is not finished. There are many more to find in the field, such as this one. So again, this is my book. It's also available in Portuguese. This is where you can buy this and other books that I have done, 16 in total. And if you would like to see some of these specimens, then please come on tour with us. In ancient Mexico, this coming February 2016. Then we'll be in Egypt in April of 2016. And then our major tour in Peru in July 2016. And it's off to Turkey in May of 2016.
So that begs the question then. Well, a couple questions. First of all, it answers one anyway. Why did the ancient people strap boards to their babies' heads? It's like, what possesses you to wake up one morning and say, you know what, I think I want to be a conehead, and I want all my kids to be coneheads. So let's strap boards to the baby's head. Why? Something clearly happened in real life that those people saw that caused them to want to emulate it. A lot of times, these characters were in positions of royalties. They were archons. They were leaders. Nefertiti, Akhenaten, the Egyptians had heads like this, right? So, but the other question is, how did this person get like this? Where did these people come from? Because they're not just in Peru. They're found all over the place. This is a female. That other one you probably can't see because my head was in the way, but that one's a male. And this one had the trepanning or trepanning, I'm not sure how you say that, but where they drill holes in somebody's head, in the top here. That's interesting too. I don't know what quite to make of that. I need that like a hole in the head. We have that saying. But the ancients, especially in the conehead people, tended to do that for some reason. I'm not quite sure why, what they're hoping to accomplish with that, or alleviate. Some say they may have had pain and that would alleviate the pain. I don't really know what to make of that. But from my research, I believe that these are remnants of the biblical Nephilim that we read about in the text. Genesis chapter 6, verse 12 says the earth and all flesh had become corrupted. Well, what does that mean? All flesh became corrupted. Well, there are other extra biblical texts that are not in the Bible but are referenced in the Bible, like the book of Enoch is one. Another one is the book of Joshua, and another one, the book of Jubilees. And if you allow those ancient texts to confirm or elaborate on what we read in what's called the canonized text of Genesis, then you have a much more detailed story about what's going on with, I believe, characters like this. Joshua 4:18 and Jubilees 7:24 said that men began to blend species together, blend different varieties of animals together, even plants, fish and lizards and birds and everything, and also to blend themselves with other creatures. So this is where you get, your centaurs, your minotaurs, satyrs, all the stuff that we see in like the Greek myths. And the Greeks aren't the only ones. A lot of the ancient cultures, the Egyptians had the chimeric creatures also. The Romans did. The Hittites did. A lot of ancient cultures depicted these animal-human chimera, these hybrids. Well, the ancient texts tell you that they were doing this in the pre-flood world. And which is interesting because Jesus said that our days, the last days, would be like the days of Noah. Well, that begs the question: what differentiates the days of Noah from any other time in human history? And I would say at least one thing that was happening in the days of Noah that didn't happen at any other time in human history was the creation of animal-human chimera, the intentional creation of hybrids. Now, you have the hybrids of the angel-human hybrids that took place 1,200 years before the flood in the days of Jared. That's where angels came down and mated with humans directly and created angel-human hybrids directly that the Greeks called the Titans. But the text said that the first generation offspring only lived for 500 years. And within those 500 years, they were to kill each other off in a massive civil war that the Greeks eventually stylized into what became known as the Clash of the Titans. Of course, we've seen the movies and stuff like that. Those stories, those myths come from that event, the War of the Gods. And then that's it. You have no other recorded document, and nothing in history saying angels ever came back and mated with women again. There are others who disagree with me on that, who study the Nephilm subject, and they're welcome to their opinions. I just say, okay, fine, show me the text, because there's no text that says angels ever came back and did that again. From what I read in Enoch, it happened once. The judgment on the angels who did that was extremely severe. They were bound up, incidentally, for 70 generations, the text says. They were to be buried under the sands of the earth in chains for 70 generations. Well, Psalm 90, verse 10 defines a generation as 70 years. 70 times 70 is 4,900 years. If my calculations are correct, and looking at the timelines that are provided for us, I believe it is correct, that event of them being bound up took place right about the time of the Mayan calendar. The Aztec calendar stones 3114 BC. I believe they're bound up by about 3050 BC. Let's just say 3000 BC for the sake of easy numbers. If that's correct, at 3000 BC, those fallen angels, the 200 Archons, the Watchers that landed on Mount Hermon in the days of Jared, were bound in 3000 BC for 70 generations. 4,900 years from 3000 BC puts you at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, right at the time of the Industrial Revolution. And I just put it out in my research. I say, hey, I can't be dogmatic about this, but isn't it interesting that for 5,000 years it was horse and buggy and beasts of burden to all of a sudden plane, trains, automobiles, supposedly putting a man on the moon, right? Sending space probes out to the farthest reaches of space, supercomputers and, iPhones and all this in 50 years, the beginnings of computers and everything else. By the 1960s, we supposedly were sending men on the moon, in a space of 60 years. 5,000 years before that, it's a flat line. So could it be that the Watchers have been released? And I just put forward the idea in my Archon Invasion Part 2 DVD, where I just put the evidence out and say, look, these are the things that the ancient texts say they taught men to do. Here are the modern achievements of mankind. It's a pretty good match. So, it looks like the Watchers have been released, or maybe are in the process of being released. Maybe some of them had a little bit longer severity to their judgment. But, they were judged extremely severely, and their offspring killed each other off. That all was done with 700 years before the flood of Noah. So then you have to say, well, okay, if all that's over and done with 700 years before the flood, why did God get so mad that he had to wipe out the world with a flood? Well, Genesis tells you, because all flesh had become corrupted. See, atheists, a lot of times, one of the reasons they become atheists is because they don't understand this evil God of the Old Testament who's like wiping out everybody and kill the women, kill the children, kill the animals, wipe out everything. You end up with this very skewed view of God as being schizophrenic and prejudiced and into random acts of genocide if you don't understand what's going on with Genesis chapter 6. When you're understanding what's going on with Genesis chapter 6, all of a sudden God becomes this amazing God of love who is actually trying to preserve his good creation from being destroyed by these abominations that were never meant to exist in the first place. Because every time it says in the Old Testament where God says, kill the women, kill the children, kill the animals, in every single case, if you read the people that he's referring to, you're talking about the Amorites, the Hittites, the Jebusites. These are the ites that I call them, the ites that the Israelites were repeatedly told to utterly destroy. Well, all of those ites trace back to Genesis chapter 10, verses 6 through 20. These are Canaanites that were Nephilim. They're described as giants. The Genesis 14 war, Josephus, the great first century historian, refers to the war that's recorded in Genesis 14 as a war against the offspring of the giants. So you've got 5 kings, where 5 kings versus 4 kings, 9 armies of giants. This is like Lord of the Rings stuff going on, fighting each other. And when you look into the writings and depictions that these guys were doing, carving in stone and stuff like that, they were also carving depictions of animal-human chimera. So they were blending species and were maybe likely the byproduct of that blending before the flood. Some of that genetics may have carried forward. So, could it be that originally these people were normal? Because when they do DNA tests on them, they do find normal human DNA in them, but they also find DNA that's not human in them. And they're like, well, this is not quite a human. This is something else. The stories of Bigfoot, the Yeti, all that stuff, Sasquatch, they're also cone heads and gigantic. So, my position is those are all genetic remnants of the original corruption of all flesh that took place in Genesis 6, confirmed by Joshua 4:18 and Jubilees 7:24, which described exactly what's happening in laboratories today around the world. Where in 2011, I was teaching a conference in Branson, Missouri, talking about the very thing you and I are talking about right now. And while I was talking about this stuff, a BBC news report came out from the UK saying that scientists had successfully cloned 140 or created 140 animal-human chimera in the laboratory, animal-human hybrids. That report came out while I was teaching. I mean, you want to talk about confirmation? I'm like, and by the way, if you got your iPhone, just, look this up. That has only recently begun, at least as far as what we've been told in mainstream media, within the last few decades. Well, Jesus said the last days before he comes back would be like the days of Noah. We are, in my position, from my research, one of the reasons why I don't believe today is going to be the end of the world is because we are only beginning to take the steps that were taken 120 years before the flood of Noah. Basically, man, at about 120 years before, that's Genesis 6:3, 120 years before the flood, God basically said, you guys better knock it off. What you're doing is not going to be good for you or anybody, because the result of blending species, one of the byproducts besides gigantism and horrendous looking hybrids was violence. They had only evil continually in their hearts and mind as a byproduct of blending species. Well, Hollywood gets this. If you saw one of the recent Spider-Man movies that came out was the one where his enemy was the lizard. And in the movie, they depicted exactly, I believe, what was going on in the last 120 years before the flood, where you've got a guy, a scientist, who's missing part of his arm. And he's a very good guy, very altruistic, philanthropic. He wants to help people. Amputees. He's obsessed with figuring why is it that you could cut the tail off of a lizard, and it grows back. I mean, what's the genetic code for limb regeneration? Because if I could figure that out, then I could get my arm back. Well, he starts experimenting with rats. Cuts their legs off, injecting them with lizard DNA, and has a bunch of failures. But finally, he has a successful one. And the rat's leg grows back. He's like, great, cool, I got the formula. So he injects his arm, the stump, and what do you know? His arm grows back. Cool. The problem is he had a very unfortunate side effect. He turned into a giant lizard-human hybrid that had only evil continually through the rest of the movie. And I'm going, man, I mean, Yeah, I know it's Hollywood, but they're depicting exactly what is written in the ancient text. That's exactly what happened in Genesis chapter 6, verse 12, in Joshua chapter 4, and Jubilees 7 describes exactly what they showed in the Spider-Man movie. And so we are in those days right now. But I just want to back up and say, to you said that you had been an atheist. I don't know what caused you to be that way, but I've had a lot of very positive response from atheists and agnostics because I was able to show them. And that's why the title had a very interesting side effect. I attracted that crowd for some reason. But then they read it, and I was actually answering some of the questions they had about this, what seemed like this, I can't trust your God. Your God's evil. Your God is crazy. I mean, look, he's killing everybody. He's fickle. People are, really, he wiped out the whole world of flood because of homosexuals. I don't want to have anything to do with that guy. But that, there was evil taking place. There was things happening. Yes, that's true. But the real reason for the flood was the corruption of all flesh from the perfectness that God created them to be, the kinds that he created, into the abominations that we see in all the various myths and legends out there. And the scary thing is we are starting to do that right now. And if you go to 2045.com, 2045.com, and read about what they're trying to do, they being the transhumanists of the world, some of the smartest people in the world are getting together and having these big symposiums, and they have a stated objective of achieving immortality by the year 2045. Well, I mean, that's just around the corner. It's 30 years away. And they have mile markers that they're, time markers that they are trying to achieve certain things along the way. And they're already on track. Some of their early ones that they had, their goals that they wanted to achieve, they've achieved. And there's all indications are showing if they keep doing what they're doing that their other markers will be achieved. And Time Magazine had an article or a front page cover at one time showing a dude with a plug in the back of his head, and it said 2045, the year man becomes immortal. Man is trying to achieve immortality, I would say parenthetically, without God. But if they're going to do it that way, it's not going to be good. And all of the stuff that we've seen, Terminator, Skynet. I mean, Hollywood gets it. They're showing it to you. And I believe maybe one of the reasons why Hollywood gets it is because how many writers, directors, producers, actors, musicians have you heard say that they channel, that they're getting their information from elsewhere? Well, I mean, could it be that the fallen ones are just telling their story, and while they're telling the story, they're trying to get us to repeat what was done before, so that all these disembodied spirits can find bodies that are fit for them to get back into again? I don't know. I'm speculating on it myself, but as I look at the evidence and as I look at the ancient record and I compare it to the biblical text, I believe I'm seeing a pattern that's actually rather disturbing when you watch the evening news and see they're following that pattern.